Welcome to Open High Streets as cultural centres. I'm Beverly Gormley and I'm the Heritage Trust Network's Programme Manager. Over the last couple of years, the Heritage Trust Network has been working closely with Locality to deliver a programme of events called Open High Streets. These events are funded by the Architectural Heritage Fund and support their Transforming Places Through Heritage funding programme. If you don't know us already, Heritage Trust Network is the UK's umbrella organisation for not-for-profits that are rescuing, restoring and reusing historic buildings, structures and spaces. If you're thinking about taking on a historic building or are in the middle of a project and need some advice from someone who's been there, done it and bought the t-shirt, we can put you in touch with one of our members or point you to our Toolkit resources. The recording you're about to hear was recorded on the 14th of July at the Old Market Hall in Devonport, Plymouth, a building that was rescued and restored by the Real Ideas Company. Our panellists, chaired by Gavin Richards from the Architectural Heritage Fund, came together on a very hot summer's day to discuss the fact that heritage-led regeneration of high streets is often linked to cultural activities as part of the day and nighttime economy. Increasingly, this is about diversification of the high street and making it more distinctive and local. The panellists, Lindsay Hall from Real Ideas, Hannah Sloggett from Nudge Community Builders and Ellen Harrison from Historic England, talked about the lessons they've learned, best practice and their thoughts on how to bring people back into England's high streets. Enjoy the recording.
Hello everybody. Welcome to Devonport Market Hall. I'm Gavin Richards from the Architectural Heritage Fund. I run a programme called Transforming Places Through Heritage, which is a programme we launched back in 2019. Essentially aimed at trying to revive high streets and town centres through the reuse of historic buildings. We provide funding for charities and social enterprises. As part of the programme, we've been running a series of workshops and seminars like this. Originally intended to be all around the country. Obviously COVID hit, so it went largely online. But pleased to be able to say we've been able to bring some events back on in person again. So this is, I think, the fourth in-person event we've done now. After one was in Lincoln, the Peace Hall in Halifax. I'll say the fourth, I've forgotten the other one. It's the third one. So I'm really, I should say I've worked at the AHF for 15 years now, which is probably too long. But in that time I've travelled all over the UK to see different projects, but this is my first time here in Plymouth, Devonport, so really exciting for me personally to see some of the work that Real Ideas has been doing in the area. We have Nudge Community Builders as well, so after lunch this afternoon, hopefully some of you will be able to stay for the tour of this building and the local area. I'm really interested to see what's been delivered locally. We've got a great panel of speakers here. I'll ask them to introduce themselves a bit later on. But we've been hit by COVID, quite a few COVID casualties, including Josephine from the Painting Picture House Trust wasn't able to make it, unfortunately. It means it's a smaller gathering, but it means you've got more chance to speak to each other and have more food. Yes. Let me just check. I should just say actually that it's the Heritage Trust Network who are delivering these events on our behalf, alongside Locality. David Tittle has also been hit by COVID. He couldn't join us today, but Bev and Faye are here from the Heritage Trust Network, so thank you for organising this today. The plan will be that we've got an hour or so with the panel, just discussing today's theme. We'll have time for some Q&As after that. And then we'll have lunch at 12 o'clock, I think, and then the plan is to meet outside the cafe downstairs for the tours. Is that right, Ben?
After lunch, Lindsay's going to speak.
Oh, sorry, yes.
About 42, and we'll meet outside the cafe.
We're very flexible with timing, so if it needs to shift, that's fine.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes today. I mean, it might be shorter than we thought. I don't know, we'll see how it goes, but it is quite hot in here. Toilets are just through here, as is the fire exit. Is there anything else we need to say about the building? Yeah, or anything else?
We're not expecting the fire alarm, so if one happens, it's real. But it's easy. The fact the doors are all open, so just go out. The lights, yes. Would you like lights?
I'm going to do that too. Hang on.
Shall I leave them off?
Leave them off.
There you go.
I should just add as well, we're recording the session, Bev, aren't we? From recording now, is it? Right. Okay then. I'd like to introduce the panel then. Well, you can introduce yourselves. Would you like to just go along and introduce yourselves and what you do and the work of your organisation?
Okay. So my name's Hannah Sloggett. I'm co-director of Nudge Community Builders. We were founded in 2017 after sort of 10 years of volunteering in our local area. We are bringing buildings back into use on Union Street, which is like a main street that connects, well, historically the three towns, so Devonport, Stonehouse and Plymouth. Union Street was built to connect the three to the Theatre Royal. And along that street, 25% of the buildings are standing empty. And we started to do a street party, and our community came out on the street and said, why is no one doing anything about these empty buildings? And that's what led to us setting up Nudge. We've now got 4 buildings, some that we own, some that we lease along the street, and have a really good understanding of sort of what's holding some of those buildings back. Is that it?
Yes.
Hi everyone, I'm Ellen Harrison. I work at Historic England and I head up the creative programmes and campaigns team there. Historic England, we're a national body, arm's length body for the government, and we really exist to champion and protect the heritage in England. And one of the really, really big programmes that we're working on at the moment up until 2024 is the High Street Heritage Action Zone scheme, which some of you may have heard of. It's working with 67 high streets across England to regenerate high streets which are designated as conservation areas, which is why we're involved. And alongside all of that capital regeneration, which comes in from around 95 million, we have a £7.5 million cultural programme that runs alongside it. The lion's share of that funding goes to the high streets taking part in the scheme. And we work with, on each high street, a consortium of different cultural and community organisations, and we simply grant fund them because they know what is best to happen on their high street to get people back onto those high streets and communities engaged. And we also have a national programme of commissions as well, because potentially that programme could be a fairly disparate piece of activity. Why does someone in Hexham necessarily kind of connect to something happening in Plymouth, for example? So we run a series of national commissions as well, which help to bring high streets together and broaden it out to people who aren't necessarily living or working locally within those 67 high streets, because of course, as we will hear today, there are more than 67 high streets in the country. And my role is to run that with my team, and also to work with those high streets and those cultural organisations to help build cultural infrastructure and capacity in those places as well, to make sure that when this programme ends, there is some form of legacy and continuity of that work as well. I do other things at Historic England as well, but I'm sure we can catch up in the breaks and things and talk about that as well. Lovely to be here.
I'm Lindsay from Real Ideas Organisation. We're a social enterprise that actually Matt and I founded about 15 years ago, and we do 3 things. We've always done a lot of work which has really started with children and young people, and the idea of how could we support creativity and new ideas that then might change, particularly the fortunes of young people who were struggling. And sort of very quickly, when you start doing that, you realise that the problem is if you just focus on children and young people and you don't think about the community and the environment around them, that you actually end up with some quite tricky situations where you can end up with young people feeling placed at a point where they sort of have to make a choice as to whether they're going to sort of, you know, go off and live a very different life, or whether they're actually going to sort of stay within, I suppose, the sort of cultural norms that they've grown up with. And so anyway, out of that, we then have got involved in, well, actually, we ended up in a slightly accidental way being asked to get involved with repurposing the Devonport Guildhall, which is just up the road there. You can go have a look at that a bit later on. And it was, you know, it wasn't intentional. It was a sort of, you know, thought about it. And that has then led us into a really bad habit of acquiring heritage buildings, listed buildings. So we now have 4. So Devonport Guildhall, this one, Locality Library, which is how we met Gavin, and also Ocean Studios, which is in Royal William Yard. So I can sort of talk more as we go along about the sort of different journeys, but I think the thing for us is that has then meant that our work now is a sort of mix of much broader spread and much broader geographical spread in terms of the sort of bigger picture around children, young people, people setting up community enterprises, change in that way, and then a sort of in-depth commitment to Devonport and to Liskeard. And be interesting, you know, it's that sort of sense of, unless you actually, if you're going to actually change buildings, it takes a very long time. So then it's that sort of sense of, okay, how can we be on a journey that is probably going to take 20, 30 years, you know, before it really realises the sort of potential versus the sort of quicker stuff. So that's broadly us.
Brilliant, thank you. I think one of my jobs today is to try and keep us on the theme, which I think could be a challenge because I think there's so much to talk about. But the theme today is high streets as cultural centres. And I think it'd be useful just at the beginning just to unpick what we mean by that, because high streets obviously it's come to mean shorthand for retail, hasn't it, essentially? I think there's been a realisation over the last 20 or more years that retail is in retreat. There needs to be more diverse uses on high streets, and part of the answer people talk about is cultural uses for buildings. But I wanted to unpick that a little bit more. You know, what do we mean by culture? I've noticed in Sheffield, but I noticed one on the way here actually in the taxi, that axe throwing is having a bit of a cultural moment at the moment. Does that, you know, are we including that as part of cultural uses on the high street? Probably. So what I was going to do is ask each of the panel members in turn actually to just, what's your take, what's your perspective on what we mean by high streets as cultural centres? And start with Helen.
Well, thank you, I'm honoured. I think that's a really, really good place to start because we may all come with different perceptions of what culture is and its definition, and for some people who perhaps feel culture just isn't for them, it's, you know, it may well be what we might term arts and culture. So, and often placing the individual as an audience member, as a spectator. And I think that has its place. I think that when you have really prestige venues, it can drive footfall, and that's really, really good. It creates really good creative economies as well. But I think culture is much broader than that. And without wishing to sound too flaky, I think it can be whatever you wish it to be as an individual. I think that I think what I'm really interested in is that intersection between cultural activity being a vehicle for better community engagement, different community engagement, bringing people together. I think very often, I think it's fine for me to say that I know colleagues at the beginning of the cultural programme imagined the outputs of the programme to be these kind of quite high-profile pieces of work, and we do have that, but I think the benefit of culture, or the definition of culture, is also about the process that the people taking part are in, and I think it's about the process which we might in this broader sector and industry call place shaping. So I think culture is a vehicle for broader outcomes, but that isn't to say that culture that we might all just wish to enjoy as audience members and spectators isn't valid. And I think our cultural programme across these 67 high streets is a really good example of that, because you have some high streets where there are amazing cultural organisations on the doorstep. For example, in Whitechapel Tower Hamlets on Petticoat Lane, you cannot move for incredibly large national organisations. But then you might have other places, like Midsummer Norton, which is in between Bath and Bristol. They don't have access to that, but yet they, with their primary school, won Best Animated Short at the Cotswolds International Film Festival. So I think it's about allowing people locally, or kind of, you know, of that place to decide what it means to them, and then it unlocks, you know, what it means to be from that place. You know, what is the identity of that place, or identities, and it also unlocks lots of reasons for people to reconnect, just like your street party, Hannah. You know, that was, I think that's as much culture as going to see a piece of theatre.
Lindsay, would you like to?
Yeah, so I think, I agree, I think culture is, actually it's a terrible word, because it's one of those words where it sort of is used to beat people over the head, actually, as well as it is being entirely misleading. So I agree with you, it's really about how people, the ways that people choose to communicate and work with each other and express who they are. And Hannah and I were both involved in a sort of conversation a couple of months ago now, because our local politicians spent quite a lot of time saying, well, there's lots of culture there, and there's not much over there, and so let's, you know, we don't want you to do that anymore, we want you to move it all over there. And so there's a sort of quite interesting workshop with about 20 organisations who do all sorts of things across the city. And of course, by the time we'd all finished just a pretty random mapping of all the stuff that we were either doing or knew of, we are awash with culture. There's no shortage of it. But there is a perception of what counts, what is valid, what's visible, who drives it, all of those sorts of things. So I think that absolutely needs unpicking. And it's interesting. I also actually think high streets is quite a loaded phrase. This building is not on what anybody would define as a high street. However, I think the concept of, if what we really mean by high street is where is there a sort of centre for people that relates to their identity, then, you know, Devonport has a really strong identity for people who come from Devonport, just as Stonehouse does, you know, just kind of Plymouth is, you know, often talked about as the city of villages. And so, but Devonport doesn't have a traditional high street because it got destroyed in the Second World War. It was out there and it was entirely flattened. So I suppose there's also something quite interesting about, because I'm interpreting it as being centres of communities, and what do we do to allow that sort of centre of community to flourish. Liscot's really interesting. It's a library building that we're converting. It's right on the physical high street. But then again, in terms of Liscard, are we just talking the town, or are we talking about a market town in the centre of a rural place? So I think, yeah, both terms are really loaded, and we sort of, I don't know, at one level I think it probably is useful to be quite clear what we mean. At another, I sort of think we have to be quite careful because, you know, we can arrive in definitions that don't quite resonate with how people feel or behave.
We've been grappling with similar issues as part of the programme, so obviously we have to define a high street as part of this grant programme, and we have been pretty flexible. So I'm recognising that many places have multiple high streets, so the high streets change different times of day as well, don't they? But I'm just thinking about lots of places have created a cultural quarter, haven't they, as well? I mean, I've seen some that are frankly a bit underwhelming, you know, like a theatre showing a bit of panto doesn't count as cultural quarter to me, but I've seen that branded in some places. But where, if Plymouth has a cultural quarter, where maybe it does have, has that been branded in Plymouth? Is there a part of Plymouth?
Well, that's really interesting, because the politics around that. So there is the way that the City Council would define a cultural quarter, which, you know, not to be political about it, but unsurprisingly is around the big buildings, you know, the boxes, which is a fantastic resource, and I'm really not knocking it, but it is the resource that they have developed. And so their sort of definition is about that, and so now the Arts University Plymouth and the university, that would be where they would talk about it. I think probably both Hannah and I would go, actually in terms of where people are busy and doing all sorts of exciting things and, you know, on the ground, it's actually much more Stonehouse and Devonport and those types of communities in a very straightforward way, because actually they are poor communities and so there's a lot of space and there are people, lots of flexibility for people to sort of buzz around and do interesting things. So yeah, that, I don't know what you
So this brings us back to you, Hannah, because you're creating it, I guess, in Stonehouse.
Yeah, so and we've been able to sort of fly under the radar a little bit in terms of sort of citywide strategies, because pretty much every sort of plan and strategy had kind of, not consciously I don't think, but sort of turned its back on Union Street because it was too difficult. And so there was this sense that, like, by focusing on regeneration around the edge of not just Union Street but Stonehouse as a neighbourhood is in the top 1% most disadvantaged on Union Street. And so there's a huge amount of kind of complex issues and complicated things that happen out on the street. And but that has created that space to then find different ways to do things, to kind of push back on some of the things that aren't sort of serving or working in our community, and kind of find more innovative, more local, more kind of culturally relevant, I guess, for our community, things that can play out on the street. And so, in a way, the fact that it hasn't been designated in any way has given us the freedom to be quite creative, and so we talk a lot about giving ourselves permission to do things, because we're, all of our board live within a mile, you know, Wendy and I live locally and stuff, so it's kind of like that sense of not waiting for, like, why don't they do something about this? It's kind of like, why don't we? And so you know, we have kind of pushed at the edges of that, like, what can you do out on the street without permission? What can you do on empty buildings without permission? And then what does that start to do, and what sort of conversations does it trigger and opportunities? So yeah, in a way we've kind of benefited from that lack of focus.
And that's really interesting stuff. I mean, I've been giving you permission to do stuff, which is a key point. I wanted to ask you, actually, this leads us to the next question I had, really, about the fact that we're talking about old buildings. Obviously, that's what the theme of what we're here today is about. Does it matter to you that these buildings on Union Street that you're getting involved with are old? What's the value there? Or is it just kind of an incidental thing, that they're historic buildings?
No, I think it's kind of really cool. So there's a real deep connection with Union Street, not just locally. It's, you know, people that have served in the military and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. You know, people across the country and wider have got a connection with Union Street. It was kind of like the naval playground for many years, and so all of those layers of history play out in how people want to participate, people want to support change on the street, the kind of support that they want to, or the kind of change that they want to see. So it's like pretty much everyone locally has a story of something that's happened on the street, and we wove that into the street party really early on, where it was like, you know, we would have music that reflected sort of all the nightclubs along the street, and then, you know, dancing that reflected some of the kind of strip clubs and all of that kind of stuff that was along the street. So it's like really looking at, like, the diverse history that's happened on the street. And that plays out in the fabric of the building. So if you look at the Clipper, for example, we've taken kind of patterns that Folston, who's one of the architects from Union Street, and put that in a really contemporary way on the front of the building. So finding ways to have those kind of echoes to things that people either consciously or unconsciously connect with along the street, mean that people feel connected in a really different way. With Millennium, the Gaumont Cinema, so we have to call it the Architectural Heritage Fund. With that building, you know, we've got people that invested in shares because they met in the building, or they remember it being a cinema. So all of that creates a really deep level of connection that you can't manufacture. It comes from all of that history and stuff.
We don't like calling it Millennium Building just because.
No, I know. It's too nice to be.
But I did see the clipper actually on the way here, just went down to taxi.
Yeah.
And saw what you're describing, the artwork on the front of the building.
Yeah, and there's patterns that we weave through the way that we work now. So that started almost by mistake with the Union Street posters. We took lettering from the theatre posters. So there used to be 10 cinemas along the street, really rich kind of history around entertainment and theatres. And so we took that lettering and used it in a more contemporary way on posters that then started to sort of play out on the street. And so that kind of spoke to people that remembered it being a theatre, but also younger generations that were kind of looking for a really different look and feel. And so then playing that through our buildings is really important, because it just adds all those layers that people can't quite put their finger on, but it makes it a community-owned building rather than something that a developer or an investor's done.
I should just ask this one actually. Who knows Plymouth here? If you put your hand, does anybody know the city? There's a few of you then, because I had to do a bit of Googling really to find out, because what I found out is Devonport was actually once bigger than Plymouth.
Yeah,
It was actually the bigger place.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, and that's the history of this, in a way, this building is that up until the Second World War, Devonport was incredibly prosperous, more prosperous than the rest of the city. And again, the naval tradition, the dockyards, this city is shaped by that in a huge way. And we had, it's a bit like I was saying, right up until the Second World War, we've had people come in who remember coming to the building when it was a marketplace with their mums and grandmas, and she's called Rita, and she said, at the time we didn't bother to go into Plymouth because everything was here. They had Marks and Spencers and Woolworths, and amazing. The photographs are beautiful of what the high street was, and they had 2 theatres, 4 cinemas. It was all here. But it was 70% of it was destroyed in the Second World War. So it was a massive sort of shift that happened. That did impact the whole city. I mean, the pictures of the bombing, aren't they? They're just the level of destruction was huge. And then after the Second World War, the Ministry of Defence expanded the dockyard. So this building ended up inside the dockyard, and that completely fractured what was left of the community of Devonport. And then it then fell into, bottom 10% multiple deprivation. It's still there. And it's taken even though it's had lots of regeneration money and all these houses are new, it's a very slow journey to sort of shift that. So it's different from Union Street in the sense that, again, huge sort of attachment to Devonport. We have people come from all around the world who talk about their roots being here, but it is unrecognisable. So we're in that sort of world of how do you reinvent, literally, reinvent in a way that is a bit different. And I think it's a really interesting sort of, lots of parallels and differences in that journey. And what we're talking about is just the sort of southwest arc of the city. The city then has, lots and lots of huge estates north of the A38, so this big dual carriageway that sort of divides the city. And there's a whole other set of things going on up there, and lots of high streets in all those communities. So it's a very, and then the city centre, which also has a high street action zone, which was reinvented after the Second World War on a master plan, which was a sort of massive grid, is actually bigger than the footprint of Manchester for a city that's tiny in comparison. So there are lots of really structural problems that sort of means the role of culture is really important, but there are some really big structural problems as well. And so it's trying to find the ways of tackling all the different elements, which I think is really I suspect most cities are the same, but it is very interesting in terms of how it plays out here.
Well, the fact that Plymouth was different settlements amalgamated is, I suppose that's fairly common as well, I guess. But
it's recent
in some places, but quite recent.
Yeah, I mean 1914 was the date when they put the three towns of Devonport, Stonehouse and Plymouth together. So that's not quite in living memory, but not far, you know.
So I was going to ask you, Ellen, actually, to tell us a bit more about the High Street Action Zone, because the Plymouth City Centre one is quite unusual, I think, in that it is a post-war development, and there aren't many of them. People usually think of heritage action zones as Victorian, Edwardian places. So, can you tell us a bit more about that, about the heritage of it and the kind of cultural programme that's part of it?
Yeah, absolutely, and you're right. Most conservation areas in this country are predominantly Victorian and Edwardian, and in fact, but interestingly, I love this statistic. Half of all high streets in the UK were built before 1919. So I think it's really important to remember that often the high street is the most immediate way of accessing the historic environment for most people, and it is on most people's doorsteps. So I think that's I like that stat. But in Plymouth, you're right. I can't remember everything about all 67 high streets. I've written it down. That it is post-war, and it focuses around what's termed as the Abercrombie Estate, which is exactly as you were describing, this kind of, very post-war optimistic way of looking at how they were going to shape this place and shape society, and in this really big kind of grid formation and a kind of really interesting window into the kind of post-war psyche of some of those planners as well, which I'd love to know kind of if they were to come here now what they think of it. But it is what we have, and I think that's why it's an important conservation area, because there are fewer from the 20th century and particularly post-war as well. And the Heritage Action Zone in Plymouth, so therefore has quite a big footprint. Some of the high street action zones are quite small areas. So yeah, it's got its set of challenges in that way, but in another really useful way, the public realm, if you like, can become a real like the backdrop or the stage for a lot of that cultural activity. And I think it was even perhaps last weekend or the weekend before, there was a huge scale chalk drawing where they were inviting people to kind of create this mass public artwork. So in a funny way, although I know that wasn't the intention of the design, that really huge scale is kind of, like you were saying, Hannah, kind of that improvised space and being able to use it is kind of played well. But the other thing that is really interesting about the Action Zone, which is led by Culture Plymouth, Cultural Development Agency, is they're doing a scheme at the moment which is called Vacancy Atlas, and it's with a number of empty shops within that Heritage Action Zone. And it's a meanwhile space, which I think might be interesting to talk about the pros and cons of meanwhile space. But it's about inviting artists and creative and cultural entrepreneurs to use those shops, and it kind of carries the risk for those people and invites people in. And then the other thing I saw happening last month, which I really, really loved, was working with local skateboarders who use that space, because sadly I never really got the hang of skateboarding, but what an amazing urban environment to use a skateboarding. But it's often, that group are often seen as perhaps outside or a nuisance to people who might want to use that space for other things, but they were working with those very young skateboarders, some of them were 11 or 12, and they were asking them what they would like to see for the future of that place. And then they created an installation in one of those empty spaces. So I think that's a really interesting use of that, which is working very closely with local communities and people who use that space. And then the other thing that I think is quite interesting as well is, I remember in their application, for the cultural programme, they wanted to use some of the funding to bring public artworks to that space from the British Art Show in October. So they're going to then kind of have public art placed around the Action Zone, which wouldn't have happened, as I understand it, the scale of it wouldn't have been there for that as well. So I think it's a really exciting example of a cultural programme, and definitely one to keep an eye on as it progresses.
I Thank you. I mean, animating the space between the buildings is just as important, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, the meanwhile space thing you brought up, I might good to bring Hannah in actually, because this is something you've got experience of, isn't it, Hannah?
Yeah, well, I guess you've got strong opinions of it. So, yeah, I think the more that we've gone on, the more we've seen how communities and culture can be seen as a way to sort of trigger regeneration, and there's not enough kind of conversation about where the economic financial benefit of that sits. It's seen as just like a good thing, and so bringing in meanwhile uses is a lot of work for a social enterprise or a small organisation, but actually if it works, what it actually triggers is better uses for that landowner. Quite often there's a process that you see where those original people that kind of worked for that meanwhile use get displaced from that community as like values change, or as people can see that, you know, there are opportunities, and the people that actually kind of invested the real sort of like, you know, blood, sweat and tears to kind of make something happen in those spaces gets displaced. So I think the conversation around meanwhile uses needs to be more connected with the conversation about the economic changes and the ownership on high streets, because what I see is community organisations being really enthusiastic but quite naive about what the change might happen. We're kind of linked up with the Brickbox ladies that work in Bradford, for example, and they were doing things in Brixton, and you know, sort of were really part of the kind of change that happened there in the market, and then find themselves like completely priced out of that whole scenario, and having to move back to, you know, where they grew up and everything. But I think we need to be talking more about that.
I mean, we're starting to see the value much more of meanwhile use. Chef, in terms of, we offer project viability grants. We provide funding to do viability appraisals, but actually, as part of that process, if you can get people in to use a building, that's real viability testing, isn't it? I mean, and if there's a sort of security about to secure that, obtain that building at the end of the process, we really value to that. The risk is that you don't end up with the buildings.
Yeah, I think if there's a route to ownership, then absolutely it makes sense, and that's kind of, so when we own a building, we then start to do quite kind of temporary uses. So at the moment in Millennium, we've got a boxing gym in there, for example, and we haven't done anything to the building, they're just using it as is. But straight away it kind of jogs you on to like what's possible and how it could be used. But I think if you're doing that in an environment where you haven't secured it, either with the council or private owner, I think you need to be like real eyes wide open on it.
That's a really important point, I think, for everyone to remember. I mean, I think we'll explore this again later in the session about ownership and routes to ownership as well. But I did have a question I wanted to ask Lindsay next, which is kind of the nub of the whole session, really, which can culture save the high streets? Question.
Yes or no?
Which I mean, you know, obviously what I mean is kind of, there are different ways of seeing what culture is out there, and you know, culture regeneration is often seen in terms of economic outputs, and is that how it has to be presented, or are there other?
Well, I think there's sort of a number of strands in that, aren't there? Because there's it probably does have to be presented like that to get money. So that's a sort of, you know. But I think more than that, and you know, I completely agree with Hannah, the teasing out the how you shift the economics is really, really important. Exactly as Hannah says, in the sense of people can waste a lot of time and energy and then end up getting priced out. I think it also can sort of go the other way, in the sense that you can have sort of lots of nice stuff, but it actually doesn't change anyone's opportunities or experiences or routes to be able to think about how they might build different experiences in communities and overcome some of the challenges they have. So it's sort of the two things, you know, for me that sort of culture and economics thing absolutely need to be intertwined, and they're not optional. So with this building, one of the reasons why we wanted to create something here which is both absolutely a community facility, but also, because it has unique facilities, is a sort of national and international magnet, is to try and get those connections going. Because otherwise you can end up in situations where, you're in a poor community, there is very little resource is shared around, and that's great to a point, but you're not actually getting any extra resource to come and interact with it, and therefore it's actually very hard for, change to happen. One of the things that's, in fact, people will be premiering at 4:30 this afternoon. So we're now starting to run 360 filmmaking clubs for children. Yesterday, Mount Myers Primary School, which is the primary school literally just over there, one of the most challenged primary schools in the city, they've been doing 360 filmmaking in here, and their kids are learning to do that. And that's really important at a whole set of levels. It's really important that those children grow up thinking these types of opportunities and industries and jobs could be for me. And they have to sort of experience that in order to feel that. Really important that their parents come in and go, oh, actually, this is something that could be really interesting, because otherwise there's lots of research which goes that, parents, for all the right, best reasons, worry about, well, no, you're not going to make a career out of that. Also that the parents, some of the parents then come in because their children bring them in. And I've had conversations with people, when we run lots of stuff in holidays, and, in fact, there was one young mum, and she had two little tiny ones, and one were at school. And she said, yeah, well, I'm here because he's been here, and he said to me, you've got to come because it's quite cool, Mum. And so it's also about how we change, how we get those interactions going. And I suppose the thing about the meanwhile stuff is, how do you give enough time for that to happen, because it takes time. And then how do you make sure that the landlords, you can't sort out better route to ownership, but the landlords actually are brought into what's trying to happen. So one of the things that we are doing in the city is, there is a very big campaign around the sort of principle of inclusive growth. And, actually, what Plymouth has done, like most cities, is, over the last decade or so, economic growth has happened, growth has gone in the right direction. I'll give you one guess as to who has benefited from that. People who are in the top 20% of earners. And the people who are in the bottom 20% of earners, no difference. Absolutely no difference. So there has been a campaign which is being taken on by big organisations and the local authority and all of that to go, okay, what does good growth look like? And so I think for me that's the other thing that has to come back into this. And I sort of, that's what I worry about some of the meanwhile thing, that it's like, oh, my building's empty, you just had COVID, yeah, of course you can do something, rather than, actually, I could think differently about this. Maybe, as a big land owner, even if I want to hang on to it, I might actually think about this in a much longer term way, in a much more interesting way. And so it's that economics and culture all the way through that we've got to balance in a much more subtle way.
I mean, my feeling is that maybe in the southwest, a lot of regions, to get the big money, it's about boosting the visitor economy a lot of the time. Is that what you need to kind of demonstrate, or is that less?
No, I mean the biggest economies the biggest economy in Plymouth is defence.
Right.
We're like 2 minutes from massive shipyard, and we're still building. We have a lot of nuclear submarines over there. So defence, marine, manufacturing. Plymouth is a big centre of manufacturing. So the visitor economy is actually, it's not important, but it is nowhere near as important as a lot of other sectors, digital, creative industries. They're all growing, rapidly. And a lot of communities we're working in are disconnected from them. And so that's part of it, is how do you get that sort of those roots in different ways. And culture is really good doing that.
I guess outside Plymouth it's more of a, I'm thinking of Cornwall, where there's that tension between culture for visitors and culture for locals.
Completely.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Well, we haven't really touched on creative businesses and that sort of things yet. Is that something that's happening in Stonehouse, Hannah, as well? Are you attracting creative entrepreneurs and that?
A little bit, yeah. So not so much the sort of higher end kind of stuff that Lindsay was talking about around sort of aspirational. I think we're more sort of meeting a need of a creative person that wants to start something and needs a kind of easy way, so they can come and sell at our market for £10 and that kind of thing. So there's some really easy entry level ways for people that want to predominantly it's kind of more sort of creative industry type people that sort of step up to that. And then in the plot which we took over just before the pandemic, we've got 19 small organisations, so you can get a shed there from £130 a month, for example. So, and that's all about creating those bumping in kind of opportunities with other people that are developing their enterprise, learning from each other, all of that sort of stuff. So I guess for us it's kind of more at that end, but also how we nurture things that play out on the street. So we've had lots of murals and things like that done. We prioritise spend within a mile. So we spend over 50% of our money within a mile, and so we have kind of connected people in the creative industries with someone that really wants to do something like a mural or something on the street at night, and said, well, work with this person who's really experienced, and kind of so those sort of kind of more mentoring type roles to make things happen on the street. You've got to be quite brave to do stuff publicly. So creating an environment where people can kind of progress on their whatever creative or sort of entrepreneurial journey is definitely kind of playing out on the street, but also much more widely. So we see people starting to move around. It would be successful if someone grew from the plot and then wanted a space at Ocean Studios and things like that. So it's kind of creating that ecosystem for someone to be able to kind of grow in the city. Because we lose a lot of our graduates, don't we, and things like that. So there is a real push to kind of create those conditions for someone to feel like something's possible here.
And so maybe real ideas as venues are the ones that are for the next level for some of those.
Some of it, I mean, I don't think it's a straight...
Sort of like,
it's moving backwards and forwards, isn't it? And also working in both venues at different times.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the thing about culture is that, and creative businesses, is that you tend to find people who, they don't have a sort of 9 to 5, it's a single job. They're doing lots of different things. And the real value, exactly as Hannah said, is to get that ecosystem working so that, we can together find routes, to support people who are, at an earlier stage in their journey to keep going and experiment. And that's hard here in a way that, you were talking about London, isn't it? It's like you fall over people who can help you do stuff. Plymouth is still, it's better within the city, but within the ecology of the far southwest, massive amount of creativity. There's quite big distances in between. So quite a lot of what we all need to do is help with those routeways, because that's what you're going to need to do in order to maintain a living. So it's really important that we had a university student who's busy editing our 360 kids film, and that means we pay him a little bit of money. That means he starts to go, okay, so I can stay here and carry on doing what I want to do. Almost certainly he'll end up, at Hannah at some point, and with lots of people who are supporting all of those things.
I've got just tell me if we're running out of time, but I've got such a good example in Wakefield, which is another one of our high streets, although for full transparency, this activity is next door to the high street in a kind of post-war shopping centre called The Ridings, and it's with an organisation called the Art House in Wakefield, and they have worked with the owner of that shopping centre, Peel, which is a really big landlord, and they run a rates mitigation scheme with them because they, as a charity, don't have to pay the rent, so they give some of that mitigation to the landlord, but in return they work on long-term meanwhile space, if such a thing can exist, with organisations, so social enterprises, but cultural entrepreneurs as well. So for example, there's this woman who I didn't meet, but she grew from the smallest shop to the biggest footprint shop, where she's rescuing products that would otherwise go to landfill for babies and young children, and selling them at cost, or maybe selling them a little bit at cost, so that all of the young families in Wakefield can come and access lower price goods for children. And then the money that she makes, she puts back into the local food bank. I mean, what an inspirational thing. But also in terms of the creative economy, they use the empty shop in there as cheap studio space for creatives who've maybe trained in Wakefield but might otherwise move to Leeds. And I went to visit them, and they were doing, you know, this photography exhibition that weekend, and people stay there in those places. And I think what Peel is finding is that it's because the art house's role is to help look after those tenants and those buildings. Peel is finding that it works for them because they're not taking on that burden. The art house makes some money from that because it's getting the rates mitigation. And then all of those cultural entrepreneurs, young creatives, social enterprises are getting longer term spaces to use, so that they're not kicked out at October when Calendar Club wants to come in to sell calendars until January. And I think, you know, I discovered this with Wakefield, and I think it's a really, really interesting model, and it's a thing I'm really interested in about the legacy of the cultural programme in general as well. So I think that with thoughtful approach and in partnership, it's actually, like, I think Meanwhile Space could evolve into something that is much more meaningful. So I just wanted to let you know about that, because I'm just so inspired by it personally.
It's just so fantastic. Yeah. What's interesting to me as well is just, well, it's a well-documented kind of trajectory, isn't it, that the creatives are often the pioneers in places, and then they regenerate places, but then they're attractive because they're affordable, property's affordable, but then it becomes unaffordable, and, you know, I guess your answer is community ownership, isn't it, essentially, at stone houses. I mean, how is that going in terms of how do you keep these places affordable and so the creative clusters can thrive and grow and don't get priced out, essentially?
We took ownership of the Clipper in 2017, and then we own the Millennium building as well, Cornwall Cinema. And I guess it's kind of, so on both of them we've done a community share offer. So we borrowed money to buy them, and then once we bought it, we reduced the amount of risk for an investor. So we got planning permission and those kind of things. And then we ran our community share offer. It's not the only money that we've needed for those buildings, but it's really patient finance. It's hard work, but it kind of creates that sort of collective ownership, but also people that really understand and are connected with what you're doing. So it means, for example, we haven't got any charges against our buildings and things like that, so it puts you in a stronger position than maybe a sort of traditional mortgage lender would leave you in. So that kind of gives you a level of confidence that's like, worst case scenario, you're going to sell it, we add value to our buildings anyway, so you're kind of in a strong sort of worst case scenario position. And then in terms of like what happens in our buildings, we hold things at a really affordable level. That's got real challenges. So we have brought in, like for example, we got the community renewal funds last year, which was able to support some people with rents and things like that. So we're really interested in ways that we can bring in finance that is then shareable with either our tenants or people that are using the building, because then the money starts to sort of flow around the building and supports us to operate as much as others. And now we're starting to look at the other empty buildings, so being much more strategic, because what we've realised is we're taking on the most complicated, hardest buildings, the most expensive to do, and actually, as the area changes, the real value is in the easier buildings. And so, we missed out on one of those just before Christmas to a London developer that has bought it to kind of flip it and all of that kind of thing. So now we're kind of looking at a way where we can effectively sort of land bank, I guess, in the way that a private developer would, but with a sort of the kind of more sort of social needs of the street in mind. So that's kind of where we're at now, is actually, you know, if the Gaumont Cinema opened, it would trigger a whole range of benefits around it, and so we need to be quite strategic now in terms of what buildings we secure in advance of doing too much to that building, so that we make sure that our local community are the ones that really benefit. And so, yeah, exploring things like covenants and stuff like that, that we can overlay areas of the street and make sure that we're sort of securing that longer term investment is something that we're looking at now.
I do think community shares in particular is a really interesting model. I think it can really work for certain buildings in certain places, can't it? How many individual investors have you had in those, do you know?
So we've had over 600 now. So
are they
yeah,
local people?
Predominantly local, and we found it really hard. I mean, we were expecting our second share offer to be easier. Our first one was like, we were really high risk. We were like, as an organisation, we were a year old. Like we were known locally, but so we had 150 investors in the Clipper, and then we had just over 400 investors in the cinema. That was really interesting because we thought we had more of a track record, like nationally and locally, to bring in some bigger investors. And yeah, still, I think it's about 80% of our investors are under £500.
And you're talking about very deprived areas we've described.
Yeah,
so
so
I think that's a real testament to...
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's great because it's meant that we're scaling but remaining grassroots. In a way, it's not great because we weren't really speaking to investors that were easily able to invest sort of £10,000 or more. And so it was, you know, it was really hard, much harder than applying for a mortgage, because you're kind of having to go out and, so in a way, yeah, you get that lovely local connection and all of that sort of thing. On the other hand, I think there's a real challenge around community shares about expecting community organisations to be able to talk and have the relationships with people with money that gives them the kind of confidence to invest. So, for example, an investor came in February, our share offer closed in December. He came in February and he said, I looked at it and, I wasn't sure and all of that. He was like, I can comfortably invest 500 grand. And I was like, but we didn't know him, yeah? And so I'm kind of really interested in how, like nationally but also locally, how can we create the conditions where someone else, like people like the Chamber and people like that have connections with people that can, might be invested anyway on the stock market or whatever, but would actually really love to invest locally. How can someone that's already got those relationships be getting the conditions ready for a share offer, so that any community organisation that comes on with the share market and things like that has that kind of reach, rather than expecting the organisation to make all of those connections. Because we've got lots of people that love the building that have invested 50 quid, and those are really valuable. Like, there's someone that came in with £5 every week. Do you know what I mean? So he's literally like saving it up.
And they will be the users, won't they? The shareholders will be the users of your venues.
Yeah.
I should ask you, how many people work for Lunch? I mean, you're still a very small...
Yeah, so there's 5 of us full time. Yeah.
So there's a lot on you, isn't there, really, to service and all this stuff?
Yeah, we've got like a really strong volunteer base and kind of partnerships and things like that. But yeah, we are turning.
I should just ask one more question, and I will ask put out to the audience to see if you want to ask questions specifically to the panel members. But we haven't really talked about the council in any of all this yet. So it's interesting to me, where is the local authority in terms of helping you or supporting you, or not helping you or supporting you? Could you tell us a bit more about that, Lindsay, in terms of your experience? Well, maybe in Plymouth and Cornwall as well.
Yes, in Cornwall. So, it's really interesting. It's really interesting to find a way to navigate to the relationship that we want. I suppose that would be my main statement, because which in the end is how to find a way of establishing a partnership. Otherwise you end up in a sort of, you can really end up in a sort of flipping between being completely ignored, occasionally patted on the head, but otherwise completely ignored, or to be honest, told what to do, or an idea that they are going to be in charge and they own you. And neither of which are, I think, where we want to be. So I suppose our experience of it has been, again, it's about time. It has been spending a lot of time over a lot of years getting to the point where we have trusted relationships with both local authorities, where, I suppose, a couple of things. We are very clear that we do not want and we do not have and we have never had a revenue grant from either local authority. And for me, that's an absolute line in the sand, because I see it a lot with organisations who even tiny bits of money and suddenly the local authority's relationship changes. So in terms of our buildings, and all our buildings are listed, so they are quite complicated. And it's they were owned by the local authority mostly. Ocean Studios were leasing, but the other three were all community asset transfers. Community liability transfers, is what it should be, but there we go. And so we can't, in the freehold at the moment, neither local authority would be prepared to transfer freehold. So therefore we can't do the share issue thing in the same way. What we have done is we negotiate 125-year leases with them, and we've just, again, put a complete line in the sand where we will not do anything if it's not at least a 125-year lease, which in effect means that you own it and it sits in your balance sheet. And we are structured as a social enterprise with asset locks and all of those sorts of things. So there's no possibility that the benefit of the buildings won't stay locked into the social purpose. So that's our sort of way of trying to guard against the sort of exploitation thing. So learning to negotiate those took quite a while. When we first did it with Guildhall, we thought 25 years was great. And we sort of learned as we went along that really was not long enough. So we had to sort of go back around it and do all of that. And then what we have found is that the bits where the local authority can be super useful are actually around things like planning, things like, I suppose, believing in what you're trying to do, helping negotiate, spotting the opportunities, dealing with the bits that are really difficult to unblock. Southwest Water, like that. Navigating some of the heritage stuff. We have to bring these buildings back into a productive use. We have a sensible conversation about what that might mean. So a lot of that is not money, but it is their time and their influence and their ability to help. But that, in the end, has come out of personal relationships with people in the right places. And then I suppose the other bit is that they have been really good at this. They've been good at sort of flagging to us when there are opportunities to access other money. And so things like helping, we had the mix of the money for this is bizarre, I'll tell you about it in a minute, but includes things like European Regional Development. Well, that came about because the local authority phoned up and went, there's an underspend, we think it's something you could apply for. And Cornwall have done exactly the same. Just telling you, just about to get something called G7 Legacy funding on the list card. I have no idea what that is. But anyway, it's a sort of that. So that role of being an advocate and a supporter and a partner is incredibly useful, but you always tread this line of no, that's where you need to stay. And I think that's super important. Otherwise you sort of drift into them somehow feeling you're sort of part of their department, and that becomes problematic. But I would say now they are really great, and we have lots of really productive conversations.
That's Plymouth you're talking about.
And Cornwall. It works in exactly the same way. They both ring up and go,
Right.
we have a bit of money, what do you think?
So I haven't fully grasped the Cornwall Libraries thing, but didn't they basically sell off all their libraries?
So what's happened, they didn't sell them off. What's happened with the libraries is, like everywhere, library budgets were slashed. And actually we were involved in the process of getting them to think about how might they approach libraries differently. And so one of the conversations was, is providing a library service actually about providing the current buildings and staffing and way we do it, or is it something else? And they also know it's something else. So, and they discovered that half their budget, they only spend 4 million a year on the libraries, and half of that budget was going on buildings and just people to literally open the buildings for not very much time every week. And so out of that came the idea of, okay, well, could they get other people to take on the buildings? And if other people took on the buildings and were enabled to use them for doing wider cultural and other types of activities, but you also took on the responsibility for the staff. And so that was the journey they went on. And so I think they've retained about 3, but the rest are being managed by independent social enterprises like us, or Falmouth Art Gallery, or people like that, or the town councils, or a few other sort of models. And so essentially what happened in that was Liscard Library, we got asked if we'd be interested, we said yes, we've been working Liscard for ages, and but then of course they turned out this great to list the building, so that sort of became like, oh, okay, so this isn't just a building that we can sort of walk into and do something easily. Actually, it's got mushrooms and dry rot and wet rot and everything. So, okay, here we go, let's sort it out. So that's been a bit of a longer journey. But it is getting there, and now when it reopens, it will be a library, and the library service will provide the books, but we will provide the environment and the staff, and we will run it in a completely different way. And then there will be lots of other things going on as well.
Which you've never done before, I assume you've never run a library before.
No, but you know,
stop here.
how difficult can it be?
So final question really to you, Hannah, what's your perspective on working with the local authority?
So ours has been quite mixed, I think. So we've really benefited from, they had the Social Enterprise Investment Fund, which was like a loan facility basically. So that helped us on our route to acquiring a clipper. Obviously, I think we've nearly paid or almost paid all of that back now. So we have taken some loans from the council. I think.
Were they interest free?
Yeah, the SIP was interest free. Yeah. The short term one that we took on to buy the clipper was at 3.6%, and that was from the housing loan facility or something like that, because we were putting 2 homes in above. And so we paid that back within 12 months, so we flushed that back with our shell basically. Relatively small amounts though, and then other than that we've quite struggled to be taken seriously, so we've kind of experienced what I think a lot of community organisations experience, that kind of quite sort of paternalistic way of kind of trying to keep you small. Not consciously, but yeah, and kind of layering on, well, first you need to do this, first you need to do that. So we've kind of pushed back on quite a lot of that because we're not taking on council assets, so we kind of just moved away. So actually, we were like, we're not doing the viability things and all of that sort of stuff, and actually working alongside a private investor for the Gaumont Cinema was really interesting, because he was like, well, I don't do a business plan before I buy a building, like why would I do that and stuff. And so you're kind of like, oh, okay. And it's like wearing a bit of that, I think, as community organisations, or as the council, kind of really create that sort of real kind of risk-averse sort of feeling. So yeah, we've struggled with being taken seriously, really, I think. That's starting to change, so particularly over the last 3 or 4 months, I think we're getting to a scale and there's this sort of credibility and things like that, that it's like, okay, these people are like hanging around and they're going to keep doing things. So I think that's starting to happen, which is really good, but I think as that happens, I really want to make sure to find a way to prop the door open for other community organisations. So we are really keen to kind of advocate that more sort of healthy risk-taking approach to taking assets on. So I just see community groups getting churned up by the council asking for more and more and more things. It takes years, doesn't it, sometimes, the asset transfer for people, and it's like, you know, the resilience that it takes for a community organisation to get through that, and then they have a building that they have to repair and all of that kind of stuff. It's like, I think there's a lot that could be done to kind of smooth that. So we talk about the fact that, like, you know, quite often inward investors are kind of wined and dined in the city, whereas actually organisations that are homegrown in many ways have they're a lot less risky, because, you know, the accountability that they have locally, it's not like we can kind of pack up and run off to Cardiff and go, oh, that didn't work out, but we'll do it over here. Do you know what I mean? We're here in the pub or at the school gates, and people go in, well, have you created those jobs you said you do, or have you opened that building yet, and all of that kind of stuff. And so I think there's stuff within the council to kind of flip that and to see the kind of the credibility and the value in a slightly different way that would be really great. But yeah, so I mean, it's, as Lindsay says, it's kind of a lot of it is relational, really. But I think it's also, I don't know, I see a lot of organisations that look for permission to the council, and unless you need a council asset, you know, you can go through the formal routes of planning permission and things like that. I think quite often people feel like they need to ask to do something, and you know, activating communities to feel like actually they can go quite a long way before they need to be asking the council or kind of building relationships with the council. Might kind of free people up a bit as well.
It's really interesting. I mean, like you said, that key point is that you're based in the neighbourhood, you live and work there, and you talk about a 1 mile radius, I think, or something.
Yeah.
So you're not going away. You're going. You're going to be there. So you might as well try and work with you.
Yeah, and it should be.
And apply the same standards to you as they would private investors who can just walk up and buy buildings without
well, they make all
scrutiny.
these promises, don't they? They make all these promises, and they're like, ta-da!
I mean, I don't think it's deliberate.
No.
I think it's a real sort of, and at one level, because we all get on with it, and we're not, you know, we are doing it, it's also like, big tip, brilliant, we don't have to even think about them.
Yeah.
So there's quite a lot of it
exactly.
is that sort of slight, sort of benign negligence, really, which sometimes is good because you just keep going, and then by the time they go, what have you done? You go, I've done it. So, but I do think they, you're right. There is a sort of, you know, but it's local politics, isn't it? It's how do you change some of that real systemic, you know, problem of local politicians who, you know, basically are only interested in something that's going to have an impact, you know, probably within the next few months because they want a ribbon to cut or they want, you know, and here the political system is terrible because basically apart from what we have 1 year off from having an election, every year a third of the councillors are re-elected. So essentially everyone is in campaigning mode the whole time. And the local authority flips between Labour and Tory pretty much every couple of years. So, I mean, one level it's quite good because, you know, they sort of know that they haven't got time to abandon each other's policies. They've got to sort of broadly keep going. But it does mean that the council staff spend a lot of time running around after whatever the latest political thing is. And, you know, and then we're all having to sort of navigate that. Yeah, but actually we're talking about something that sort of needs to carry on, you know, you can't just stop because you're out of office again.
And I guess it's our role in what you were saying earlier, Lindsay, around the inclusive growth as well, isn't it? It's like the types of people that we choose to employ and the way that we choose to spend our money and all of those things. Those don't necessarily come through with the big shiny, you know, 12 million on this kind of thing. And it's actually, so in a way we're extracting more value out of what we're doing, and so finding ways where that can be recognised and speak in that more sort of economic way could really help as well.
I should really bring in the audience, really. Does anybody have any questions for any of our panel members. I mean, obviously there will be time at lunch as well to talk to people, but I've got a hand up with that.
I think that Hannah's comment about resilience really hits in the up with me. Working for the Heritage Trust Network, we bring community groups and organisations together regularly to network, to achieve that, to talk about problems they're having and how they can help each other out. And particularly over the last couple of years, the networking meetings that I've been involved with, practically all of them have involved one or two people bursting into tears because of the personal knock-on effect of the setbacks having particularly through the pandemic as well. But I think you mentioned about sort of organisational resilience, but what about personal resilience with you and Lindsay as well? Because you're obviously people that have got massive amounts of passion, in your local community that you're trying to spread throughout the community and make sure everyone's involved. How do you keep your passion and your resilience high? And your staff as well, because obviously you must get knockbacks like building out on and personally, how do you do it? Utmost respect.
Well, I jump in the sea a lot, so so that's like my rebrief. But yeah, I think it's really hard. I think it's kind of finding your network. So there is a trusted network in Plymouth. I gave Lindsay lots of it's so hard conversations and a community share offer and stuff like that, and it was no, it's still awful. So yeah, it's kind of finding your safe spaces, I guess, I think, which kind of did happen through the pandemic, didn't it? Online, people almost felt like they could say more sometimes, I think, than they would in person. So I think that's really important. I think for us, there's stuff around kind of clocking the progress, which we're getting better at, is actually you can feel like you're not getting anywhere, but when you stand back or if someone else looks at it, you can see that actually things are happening and stuff. So finding ways to recognise that and celebrate that and kind of listen to it, I think, is really important as well. But yeah, it is really hard. I've tried coaching and stuff like that, and it's quite difficult to find ways that you feel really sort of supported and fueled up. It is quite draining, isn't it? And it is really hard. But at the same time, I guess there's real moments. So we have a soup kitchen at Union Corner, so I go there every week, and you just sit there and just kind of reconnect with your kind of why and what's important and kind of what's relevant and things like that. I find that sort of stuff really galvanizes us. We had this guy that went to sleep in the garden at Union Corner. He's one of our kind of regular people at the soup kitchen, and he needs to drink, otherwise he'll fit. And he just decided to sleep. Me and Mandy were really busy, but we ended up spending 2 hours with this guy that we couldn't move from the garden. But actually, when he got up, and then the conversations that we had afterwards, it was probably about 6 weeks ago now, that's influencing what we're doing sort of over the next 6 months, years. We've had already conversations with different partners and stuff. So it's kind of it's noticing the things that give you that sort of energy and sort of fight back, I think. I don't know, it's hard. What do you think?
Yeah, swimming.
Yeah.
As
Yeah,
you
swimming.
see every day, there's obviously something about the sea that's really good. And I think it's exactly what you're saying. It's trying to keep a balance between the sort of purpose and when you see things changing and all of the sort of admin and all of that sort of stuff. And so and just trying to make sure you have enough fun. It's really easy for these things to be a bit overly serious. And so so for me, I will, things I had a really good laugh this morning when I was watching this 360 film that these kids have made. And we will definitely have fun this afternoon. At the beginning of the week, we had the European Parkinson's Disease Association come into the building, and that was a sort of innovation, 2-day innovation lab. People with Parkinson's, neurologists and technologists, mostly for the university, all thinking about how they could sort of communicate the fact that when you have Parkinson's, quite a lot of people get a creative burst. And so, you know, they were wanting to make immersive content and think about it. And, you know, and that was sort of going on. And then, you know, there was Lego robotics with more small children and schools and, you know, lots of people in doing stuff. And I think you have to sort of, like, take the time to get excited about that. Otherwise it can become, you know, bloody builders have not sorted out, you know, doors that don't work, or, you know, somebody's moaning about something, or, you know, everybody's got COVID and, you know, we've got enough stuff. You know, it's just keeping the balance going. And I think, I don't know, I just, you know, I'm constantly excited by the sort of energy that comes off other people. And I think that's, I mean, we're just so lucky because we end up in the middle of all of these sort of networks and communities, and you know, people just pop up, don't they? Just pop up going, what about? And if you can mostly say yes, then that actually is really energising, and so you sort of keep going. And then the bits where you go, no, why are we dealing with that? You know, you just have to try and keep those in.
Yeah.
But you're right, you do have to have a lot.
The fun stuff is, so through the share offer, and I still don't know where this came from, I crocheted a whole shopping trolley and put lights on it and stuff, and it just became more and more bling. It's got wing mirrors and stuff, and it was nice. And then the other one that I made, so when we first took on the Go On Cinema, it was full of pigeons, and we needed to have the pigeons removed. And I had this real moment of the fact that these pigeons had lived there for 15 years. So I asked the guy to keep 3 pigeons, and I froze them, and we've had them stuffed, and they're going to go back in the building. So it's like really funny things where it's like, this is really horrible and expensive to deal with, but actually, I'll look at those 3 pigeons in 5 years.
Like freshly dead.
Yeah, like I had to clear a whole bit of my freezer at home. My husband was like, what the hell? I was like, I had to wrap them properly and stuff, and then like send them off. Sorry,
pigeons are definitely a thing. So I've got loads of pigeon stories in the Guildhall particularly. We now have a sort of net which, when you come in to the hall, because we used to get pigeons fly in sometimes when people lived on, and then there was like a whole saga about how to get the pigeons out, you know. And so there's a real sort of like pigeon thing. And actually, lovely Rita said to me that the upstairs of the market hall was used as a pigeon loft before the Second World War. So
it's a secret link to it all.
there you go. There's a whole pigeon thing that goes there.
Well, I find it really fascinating, all of these stories. I'm really looking forward to seeing the building as well and the area. But are there any more questions before lunch?
Can I just ask you this? I'm Kate Welsh from North East England.
Oh, lovely
I
Kate.
finally come
Hey, Kate.
so I've got to take the opportunity. And my day job is running social enterprise stuff, so partly how I know Lindsay. And 5 years ago, we took on a community asset transfer of grade 2 status building from Sunderland Council on the fringe of the city. So we're in a sort of semi-rural area, small town. The question I suppose, and actually give the council the due 4 months to do the community asset transfer, but only 30 years that we're not going to buy. So I'm good. The challenge for us is when we've been applying for various different opportunities. So, for example, the community improvement district part of it, our local authority do not back us because they have a heritage action zone. They've already invested in a new deal for communities. That's got a much longer term community ownership. We were really new, we're up in going 5 years, we're on the fringe of the city. So it's kind of, I suppose, partly across the name to funds in some ways, or people involved more of that, is how do you view that? Because you run it very sympathetically when Lindsay and Hannah talked about relationships with the council, because they're very supportive of us. They've also quite roundly told us, don't you dare put in a bid to fund until our main high street, well, because you won't get there because our main high street, you know, we're going to do our big ones ones first, and then you might get a turn. Whereas we're sitting there with our neighbours, basically people in our community really, really fed up because they don't feel part of the city. They were used to be County Durham until 1973, so we still have a DH postcode. There's all of that stuff. So it's kind of partly how you view it. We might not be able to get that local authority backing simply because they've chosen back somebody first, whether they're not unsupportive of what we're doing. So it's just kind of a question in that sense.
It's a really interesting dynamic, and I think it is hard for organisations like us because we rely on the local authority to kind of represent, and I suppose rather naively, I think that they're doing that when they apply to us. But actually, when we spoke on Friday as well, there is this kind of decision-making process where the local authority is the filter for which this funding goes, and it is really problematic. As someone that is more around public engagement, and so therefore doesn't have this background in kind of grant funding, it's something I'm new to, and it's definitely something I want to kind of ask my colleagues in our regional teams about, because it's difficult. I think it's a universal truth that everyone is stretched for capacity, and so how can the teams in our regional offices get under the skin of a place to know about that kind of dynamic? That's really hard for us because there aren't enough of us. How can a local authority make these really difficult decisions and show investment? And really interestingly, I think there was a thing around culture and levelling up in the north, and one of the findings of that all-party parliamentary group was, please stop putting us in competition with each other, let us work together. And that really resonated with me because, ironically, in this conversation, there are high streets, local authorities who gained Heritage Action Zone, which is tiny compared to the Towns Fund. And so they were then coming to us and saying, on balance, we're probably going to put more resource into that grant fund pot because it's so much bigger. So we won't be doing as much as we first thought, So so in a way, we get caught up in that prioritisation as well. I'm afraid I don't have an answer, but what I will do is speak. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Does it give you also local petty politics as well? Which is an issue
It does happen. I mean, it absolutely happens here. The decision about the city centre was completely council-led, and didn't, probably align with where we actually think more interesting high street stuff could have gone. There was no discussion. That was the way it was. That's definitely true in what's going on in Cornwall. They pick places, and so you just have to be in the conversation, I think, and then either find ways of spotting the odd moments, and that which I'm sure you're doing all the time.
We do it anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And some just go, whatever. And I mean, the money for here, I'll tell you in a minute, but it was random. It really is not. There is actually no heritage money gone into restoring this building at all. I think it is really tricky. But there isn't a sort of immediate answer. But it's definitely a thing, definitely an issue, and I think it's something
we experienced it because we have people nationally going, oh, you're going to do the Future High Streets Fund, you're going to do the Heritage Action Zone, it would be perfect for Union Street, and we couldn't get a voice in the council. It was we've already decided this is what we're doing, and there's no, unlike some decision-making processes, there's not actually any kind of participation. It's making me think, I don't know whether it still meets Lindsay, the funders for where the lottery and rank and people like that. So some of our funders all get together, and whether there's a process like that where the council can be more explicit about their longer term funding priorities, and people can, other people can see whether they can row in on that, or maybe give voice to some of the other people that they know. But it is really difficult. We just ended up, so we wrote an alternative Heritage Action Zone and shared it. So we shared it with our kind of connections. We said this is what we would have put in. So we didn't submit it as an application, but we said this is what we would have done. And then we asked the council, so what can we do next time to be higher up the priority list, which, to be fair, to them, they are starting to do, so with like levelling up and things, it kind of got us on their radar a little bit. So stuff like that might help as well to kind of demonstrate what you could have done. Yeah. Yeah.
Like sort of our own perspective, saying that this is what we can do.
And I suppose also see if you can find, and it comes down to people, you know, there are a couple of people in economic development who get the idea that what you need is a pipeline of projects, and I think that's beginning to be something that's opening up the idea that it might not be right now, but let's at least know what's on the agenda, and that's quite a live conversation, which, you know, it's just slow, and I think that is probably the biggest thing.
I'm conscious of saying as well.
Well, it's just it is, you know, some of it you just can't shortcut. Yeah, that's the issue. So.
Thank you.
There's another question.
I was just going to come back on that. So full disclosure, I'm from a local authority.
That doesn't mean you're evil now.
But just listening to you does really resonate. We do have to make those decisions. So yeah, completely get it. And actually that's, you know, just made me think. But also that pipeline is really important, because that is exactly what we started to see, because the opportunities are changing all the time. So levelling up, shared prosperity, we now have time to do that, have a pipeline, and know one thing that actually, when the next opportunity comes along, or one gets somebody, you can put it into another pot. So I think it's really good. It is about that communication, that probably is, I think you're right. As with anything, it's about those person-to-face, it's about finding the right person. Building that relationship, communication going all the time, so that they're aware of the projects, that actually they can put them in those right pots, and kind of, if you're ready to go, you know, you have such a unique advantage. So it is, but yeah, it's funny. It's just listening to you does make you think. But you know, we had a few high street coming at us, and we had to make a decision on the town. I guess from our point of view, we went through a kind of a democratic kind of process where we talked to everybody about which one we should go for. But it does always make you sit back and go, you know, did we really, you know, kind of talk to everybody and really understand that when we look at things. So it's remind us.
To be fair, I think the process can be challenging, can't it, as well? The deadlines have been quite
Yes,
tight.
deadlines are always a problem.
And
have
local,
stuff ready.
you know, and local politics is a massive part of that too. Yeah. But yeah, and the process is they're really prescriptive. Mm-hmm. So, you know, sometimes you get kind of like, you know, there's this opportunity, head down, and you know, it's hard sometimes to look up and kind of look at the right position, where you kind of just need that constant communication, so you have that knowledge, so that it becomes second nature that you think about them.
But some places definitely miss out. I mean, I've seen that there are some places that have got everything. You know, towns deal levelling up, you know, high street hazards. Other places that on the surface seem just as in need, they've got nothing at all. You've seen that all around the country.
I'm also a conservation officer.
Oh,
so, yes,
okay.
I do really want to see buildings and stuff. But no, this is about culture, and this is kind of a broader question. So we're doing a future high streets project in Barnstable, which is our little town, and we want cultural things to happen. You know, that's the whole point. We've got these buildings, and we want them to be used by people, and you know, we want them to be full of market places. But it seems to me there's a bit of dichotomy, and you ladies are fantastic examples of grassroots things that have come from the ground up. And we are on a different side of the fence. We're almost providing the spaces, but we want culture to happen within those spaces. And so I guess my question to you is, how far can we strategise our culture and say, yeah, we have some culture happening here, please. Because yeah, we can do a strategy, but how far do we direct, organise and strategise it? And how, when we kind of know that that's not going to work, really, and what we want is people like yourselves, and then that then leads on to another question, like, are you the hybrid version of the Building Preservation Trust that we've got one of those, how, you know, how can it transfer? Or how do we encourage people without being patronising to come and do what they want to do, or we would love to happen and evolve? I think that's the key thing, is actually an evolution of culture, whether that's the festival when everybody parades their floats down the streets, or, you know, all sorts of strange things can happen. But that's really difficult to plan. How do we
encourage that to happen without being too dictatorial.
Can I ask
Go on.
as a community group who has to work with the council to allow that kind of stuff to happen, you could make it really accessible and easy. You could make it much cheaper to have road closures and use of buildings. You could have that ability for people to make their own provisions. So rather than have everything duplicated and this accessible to the end really, you could make that templated so people could take the template away for it effectively so it fits both processes. So there's a whole way of making the process really accessible and straightforward for community groups who are often led by people who aren't working there full time. So just in terms of the capacity and the energy to engage with statutory services, make it so much easier for them if you've got a full-time job and they haven't. We discovered our safe events team managers, grannies and found 96-year-old garden volunteer. And from there on it's been very, very easy and they've got charges for the land licence, to use the farm and all sorts of other things. But and he comes back when we talk about the big stuff and says, no, you're not going to fill any of that in. This is the one thing we do. And make it so much easier.
Involves revolution.
We couldn't find his name. The local authority did not publish the name of the contact person on the form. They didn't give you a very clear set of forms. It was lots of different things. So you had no idea what you had to do. And then Joyce says, oh, my grandson David does that. So these are so many ways. And David, of course, David's going, oh, my granny loves coming to
I think the other bit I would talk about to it is also, in terms of, particularly when you come to buildings, is don't overdesign them. Try and find.
This is all having this argument.
It's space, that's all we need.
That's
space.
really,
Yeah.
So that's actually really reassuring to hear. Because I think we're being a bit specific, or the tendency is to be very specific with your architect. We want a performance space there, we want a cafe there. But you're saying
Don't.
Basically, space.
Just space, and it needs to be dry, and it needs to have power and soundproofing. Remember soundproofing. And but sort of other than that, try as early on in the process to sort of find people who might get excited about animating it. So exactly in the ways of being told, who are the people who've got the ideas, and then sort of make it as flexible that people can come in and take their ideas and move things forward. And sort of, it's quite an infectious thing. Once you can find a few of those people, I'd almost be guaranteed that they'll be pretty well networked between themselves. And so, it's just actually sort of creating that space for some of that to sort of come through. And then, resisting the architects going, it's got to be this and it's got to be that and it's got to be the other, because absolutely guarantee, however they design it is not how it will get used. And it needs to be able to change all the time. And that's sort of probably the most important thing. So I get really frustrated by the sort of, it's going to be, like you say, a performance centre, and you go, okay, so who are the performers who are excited and want to drive it and run it? Oh, well, we haven't really got performers. Oh, but we've got all these other people. Well, could you not create space and allow those people to start the conversation and move it forward?
Because I'm doing some work with chiefs, heritage actions out there, mapping the cultural and creative sector in the town, and understand who is there, in the first place, and how you're engaging with them. And it starts with the small groups that actually were the typical Article in Blue, something like that, the theatre and things like that. But actually, when you look at the creative industries, it's much broader. And most of those commercial businesses, whether they're one-man band artists or potters or something like that, or either people who are doing video stuff and they're actually working across globally, but they're actually based in that location. How do you harness that in? So I think mapping and understanding what your cultural sector is like in Boston.
They're involved in that.
Right.
Just sort of strategy and idea. But it's a really. I guess it's quite organic, isn't it? It's obvious. really great.
I think I have a lot of sympathy for you because an arm's length body may as well be a council in terms of the way it thinks sometimes. You know, it's very hierarchical and it's very risk averse, and I think my advice would be just call it something a pilot, because often when you pilot something, people then feel, okay, we can experiment with that a little bit more, and then suddenly the pilot becomes the reality. I've never pointed it out since, but I often say it's a pilot. And then, and the other thing is, there is real power in being as unprescriptive as possible, and it's really hard, and this requires personal resilience as well, but to get your colleagues to buy into and feel reassured that it is okay not to know the answers, that what will happen at the end. Yeah, exactly. So it's about saying that the process is as valid as the results. And a really good example is with the cultural programme. We work with our grants team, and normally they have an incredibly complex application process, to your point, about trying to make it easy and accessible for people. And we work with them to make the application form as streamlined as possible and as easy as possible. I don't think we got there entirely, but we managed it because it was sort of an extraordinary set of circumstances, and we haven't done cultural funding before in that way. And now it's the basis for a really big grant scheme we're doing called Everyday Heritage, which is about celebrating working class heritage. So again, that innocuous pilot then went on to influence things. So I just think sometimes it's about how you frame things, and then being upfront about we don't have the answers, and that is actually fine.
Yeah, but I think the difficult thing is read from those. So something like future hygiene is fine. You have to put in the outputs.
Yes, they are very prescriptive.
Right at the start, and actually that is what would be really nice, wouldn't it, to be able to be a bit more flexible, but actually to be flexible, but they are kind of being quite flexible on that actually as long as those outcomes, there is some flexibility there at the moment, which it hasn't always been. So, but that's part of the problem, isn't it? You have to prescribe it, but that almost is the expression of interest stage, where I think all of that is a little bit of
But I think to echo Anna's point, we spent a lot of time saying it's going to be an immersive technology centre.
Yeah.
Everybody went, oh, what's that? That'll be wonderful. And it's actually sort of really it's just creating space for things to sort of develop. And at one level, it's not very difficult to go, well, we think we could probably create 20 jobs, but just don't say what jobs.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of it's that sort of, it's just creating space. But at the end of the day, I would also really try and find the sparky people, and try and get them in early enough, and try and do actually they will invent it, and it will not be what you imagine, and that would be brilliant. Yes. And I get that's a really hard thing, because, and that's probably, in the end, that's probably what Hannah and I spend most of our time doing, just going, trust us, really. Yeah. And you get to a point where people do, but it just takes quite a lot of time of just sticking to your guns about, we're not quite sure, but it's going to make a real difference. And then, like you say, we can always point to those stories of, the chat you were talking about, or the children who've grown up and done something, or the young people who come back who are, it's really brilliant. We've got, I think, now 2 of the people because we run a membership scheme here, who've come and now creative working, are people we worked with 10 years ago in a school on the other side of Plymouth, who've sort of, come up with creative careers they never even dreamed about. And those sort of stories, we know because we deal with them, they're people. And that will happen. That will absolutely happen. You just have to leave the space for it, and it's just, it's writing it like that, convincing them that that's what it will do.
We've started to talk about it as in creating the conditions. So that, because then you can be in control of the conditions. Like we've just put electric points on the front of 12 businesses along the street. So it's not like there will be Christmas lights or there will be this, but we've created the conditions for things to happen along the street.
But it's just that whole sense it's an environment where people live next to it.
And definitely insurance as well, so picking up on the list that Karen, we've got public liability insurance for 30 things to happen on the street, so when someone comes along, it's like that's just another barrier that's removed to them performing or doing whatever they want to do outside. So things like that can just reduce the sort of level of barriers for people.
I really think we should break for lunch now, but it's been really fascinating. Thank you, Lindsay, Ellen, Anna. Really fascinating discussion. We can obviously keep talking over lunch as well, but